Hi, everybody. This is Tony Nash with Complete Intelligence. Thanks for joining us for another quick hit. Today, we're talking with Isaac Stone-Fish of Strategy Risks. Isaac, thanks for joining us. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and about your company?
Thanks, Tony. So Strategy Risks quantifies corporate exposure to Beijing. I started this because I got frustrated at the way that ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance providers were ranking Chinese companies and US companies that had exposures to China. So I thought it would be fun and interesting and hopefully very useful to have a different way of measuring and quantifying this exposure.
Okay, great. And then can you, just so people understand, I mean, I know a lot of people know who you are, but can you talk a little bit about your background as well so people understand the credibility you bring to the topic?
So I grew up in Syracuse, a nice little place, but basically about as far away from the center of anything as possible. So I started going to China when I was 16 for something different. Started in Western China, ended up living in Beijing for about 6 years, worked in journalism mostly, was the Asia editor at Foreign Policy, spent a few years doing a mix of public affairs, commentating / bloviating, writing, and then got into this business roughly 6 months ago.
Perfect. Okay, thanks very much. So it's really interesting looking at ESG and public markets. And I think, we've seen over the past few years a lot of tensions between China and the US. I mean, they've been there for 10 years, but they really took shape over the last few years, right? And so if you're a publicly traded company today in the US or traded on a US exchange, what are the things that you need to really think about with regard to China? What are the biggest kind of risks and biggest considerations that you're talking to your clients about?
I think one thing that people overlook is the risks of their China strategy, not in China itself, but globally and especially in the United States. So the rules for engagement in China are so different for these corporations in China than they are in the United States. And the US is drawing some pretty thick regulatory lines, especially around Xinjiang, the region in northwest China where there are roughly 1 million Muslims in concentration camps, that a lot of times these major corporations, their China offices, will ignore or overlook or not put nearly enough attention on. So the kind of messages that we're communicating and the things that luckily are starting to bubble up into these boardrooms is the understanding that to have a China strategy, you need to have a global strategy that is very aware both of what Beijing wants, but also what the Biden administration and many American people want.
Okay, so for the last 15, 20 years, it almost seems like companies have had a global strategy and then they've had this China strategy off to the side because it was such a big market growing so fast. And so it seems to me like you're talking almost about the normalization of China in terms of performance expectations, social expectations, those sorts of things. Is that right? Is that kind of what you're implying?
I think one of the smartest ways that the Chinese Communist Party, which has ruled China since 1949, one of the smartest things they have done is made it seem like their country was a normal country. And there's nothing aberrant about China or the Chinese people, but there's something quite aberrant about the Chinese Communist Party. And the rules for playing in China are quite different than they are in basically everywhere else. And so what we're starting to see, and I think this is a very hopeful sign, the sign that I'm encouraging, is the realization that companies need to do something to limit the influence of Beijing on their corporate headquarters, on their products, and on their decision making.
So, but can you do that actually? Because if you're, say, an automotive company and most of your revenues come from China, and the Chinese government says something, it seems really hard, and companies have been awkward about doing that for the past, say, 10, 15 years, really changing. How do you help companies kind of kind of treat them like any other country. I think I think what you raise about what the CCP has done since 1949 is amazing. It's great. It's great perspective. But can the CCP understand that they're being normalized as well?
The CCP are doing this as an active strategy, in as much as such a complex institution has a single strategy. They're certainly trying to make people think that they are normal in our sort of Western liberalism definition of that. Most of the companies that we talk about in this space, the US is a far more important market for them, or a more important market for them than China. And I think the NBA is a great example. You know, China is its growth market, but USA is far and away its most important market. And what companies are starting to realize is that what happens to them in China and what touches China doesn't just touch on their business in China, but affects their business in the United States as well. And what we do at Strategy Risks is less working with the companies like the NBA that are having these problems, but work with other people in the financial chain, institutional investors, pension funds, endowments, and explain to them the different risks and exposures that they'll have with the companies in their portfolio, and some of the problems they might have with being overweight in certain companies, both Chinese or American, that are complicit in Chinese human rights abuses.
Okay, interesting. Now, from a portfolio investor, I have a bunch of other questions I want to ask you, but I'll get this one out first, then we'll get to other stuff. From a portfolio investor perspective, kind of until very recently, you could park a whole lot of money in, say, Hong Kong, and then dip into China as needed. But it seems that that's becoming less of kind of an easy strategy since the crackdown in Hong Kong last year. Is that the case, or is Hong Kong still pretty in a pretty good place to kind of take advantage of mainland stuff?
So from a pure markets perspective, Hong Kong is still an excellent place for that. What's really changed is the safety and the rule of law and the feeling of security for people doing deals in Hong Kong. But I mean, Hong Kong is still an excellent window into China. And I think we're seeing Shenzhen and Shanghai supplanting a lot of what Hong Kong is doing, and Seoul to a degree. But I think the issue with Hong Kong is much more for the people there as opposed to the people who are using it as a conduit.
Right. That's really interesting what you say about Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Seoul, because I've been seeing that take shape over the last 5 or 6 years, and it's interesting that it's getting a lot of traction. Okay, moving on to the kind of the other side, with Xinjiang and with other things happening socially in China, what about things like nonprofits? You know, issues that they have to raise in China. How can you operate a nonprofit? Let's say a Western nonprofit in China, and stay true to your mission if it's kind of awkward with Beijing or with the CCP, which are one and the same?
I mean, most times you can't. And I think what's been happening is that a huge amount of Western nonprofits sometimes it's this evangelical view, and sometimes it's just, well, this is a very important country filled with a lot of lovely people, and we want to come here and do good. But they find that knowingly or unknowingly, their message and their mission gets corrupted because they need to work with their government partners. And sometimes their mission is wholly at odds with the mission of the party. And so they have to make sacrifices that I would say perverts what they're doing. We see this perhaps most intently in both the very human rights focused nonprofits and in the environmental focused nonprofits, a lot of whom have found themselves being very praiseworthy of what Beijing is doing, even though China's far and away the worst polluter and the worst carbon emitter. And so they take signs coming from top leaders that Beijing is committed to making these changes, even though the changes often don't get made. But they're finding themselves in a position where, in order to be there, they have to sacrifice some of their credibility. And a very heartening sign I'm seeing is people are saying, maybe I don't actually need to be in China in order to do something that's positive for the world.
Okay. Do you see, again, back to that normalization theme, if that's possible, do you see a path to China having that type of environment in 5, 10, 20 years time? Or do you think we're kind of on this really, is it slower than that?
It's such an important question, and I wish I had some good way to answer it.
Mm.
China, as Chinese officials love to say, has 5,000 years of history. The Communist Party has been in power for what, 1.5% of that time. So at some point in the near future, the party will no longer rule China. Will that be next year? Will that be 30 years? Will that be 200 years? It's so hard to say, but it's certainly not inevitable.
Okay, very good. Isaac, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. For everyone watching, please subscribe, leave comments on the bottom, and Isaac, good luck, and I hope we can reconnect to you again later in the year. Thank you.
Thanks.